Imagine the neighborhood in which you live without any houses. Imagine the land upon which your house sits, or even the hill upon which our church sits. What do you see? Each season, the land and the hills look different. In the late fall and early winter, there's a dusting of green after the rains. I mean, this just started like last week, I think. In the spring, the mustard grows up really tall, sometimes as tall as 8 feet. It's green with those yellow flowers. And then in the summer, it all turns to brown, of course, and then we become a fire hazard around here. But it's that brown that gives California the moniker of being the Golden State. And of course, there are critters. Who comes out in the late spring? Rattlesnakes, right. So I suspect there aren't many of us trekking across the hillsides, forging our own trails in the late spring, summer, and fall. We have great trails around here to hike if we choose, that are maintained by the Rancho Simi Park District, and plenty of well-maintained roads. It's easy for us to get around. In fact, there's so much room, so easy for us to get around, that most households in our area have at least one car per adult in the household. And I think with the exception of school drop-off hours, the traffic around here is pretty smooth. We don't run into a lot of traffic jams or gridlock like you might in downtown LA. So imagine the Conejo Valley as you know it now. Imagine all the homes tucked into the hillsides. I remember when I first moved here in 2006 being amazed by how many people actually live in Oak Park, let's say. The hillsides remain pretty much unblemished. As you're driving along, you see hills, not necessarily houses. The community has been very well planned to maintain the beauty of the natural world. The mountains and the valleys remain mountains and valleys, while still providing room for growth and development. In today's gospel, Luke tells us about John the Baptist's proclamation of the coming of Christ, the coming of the kingdom of God. And he does this by quoting from the book of Isaiah, saying, "The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. And the crooked shall be made straight, and rough ways made smooth. And all flesh shall see the salvation of God." Now, I've heard this gospel for years, since I was a little kid, and I've always wondered about the straight roads and those valleys that are filled in and the mountains that are brought low, how that is a visual of God's salvation. To me, it sounded like a visual of nothingness. We like our twisty-turny roads. I mean, when we plan a community, we don't plan things on a grid so much anymore. We go for the aesthetic. We like our valleys and our hills, our mountains. There's an aesthetic to this that is pleasing to us. But in Jesus' day, in the years following when the Gospel of Luke was written, as well as before Jesus when Isaiah was a prophet and making his proclamations, and when Isaiah's words were being written down, these images of valleys being brought up and hills being brought low were hopeful and restful. Now remember our imagining the Conejo Valley 300 years ago. That's probably a lot like what ancient Israel looked like. Cities were spread out, actually not very far, but when you're talking about walking on foot, it was quite a distance. And in between was wilderness and hills, rocks, what we might consider weeds and scrub. So in order to travel, you had to hoof it over these hills, on these rocky paths, on these trails that have only been made by so many people walking in the same place over time. And of course, there were Roman roads, which were very well maintained, but the Roman roads weren't particularly safe. There were bandits, robbers, all kinds of issues on the Roman roads. So it wasn't as easy for the people of ancient Israel to get around as it is for us. I think about what could approximate this feeling of, valleys being brought up and mountains being made low, and these paths that are passable. What could approximate that feeling for us? And the closest I get really is something that's just a matter of convenience. I mean, think about if the proclamation of God's salvation was no traffic at 5 o'clock on the 101. That would be pretty exciting. It's pretty much guaranteed that you're going to sit in a parking lot for a good period of time if that's the way you're coming home from your work commute. But that's still just a matter of convenience. It may drive us crazy, but it's not the kind of danger that the people of ancient Israel dealt with when they traveled. So I want to take this metaphor of mountains and valleys and these well-maintained roads as indicative of God's salvation to a different level of our understanding, and maybe one that will make a little bit more sense to us. In Jesus' time, there wasn't any idea about mental health. That was not something that was discussed. People were afflicted by demons. So that might be what we would call a mental health issue, or perhaps it was something like seizures, a neurological issue. But whatever the case, the people around Jesus knew what it was like to suffer in body, to suffer in mind, and to suffer in spirit. And whatever we call it, mental health or seizures or whatever, we all know what it is like to suffer in body and to suffer in mind and to suffer in spirit. And while we may not want our geographical valleys raised and mountains leveled, we can see God's salvation in the valley times of our lives, in those times of loss and grief. We can see God's salvation in lowering the mountains of fear and anxiety, those things that quicken our pulse, make us anxious, take hold of us so that we find ourselves reacting from those mountain heights rather than responding from a place that is grounded in God's grace. In those mountain heights of fear and anxiety and valleys of loss and grief, God is with us. We have a spiritual grounding that we can lean into, a spiritual community that we can lean into, and a God who loves us, who wants us to grow into a life marked by abundance and all that entails, not a life that is a roller coaster of ups and downs. Now, that is not to say that we shouldn't feel deeply and passionately, but rather that in our deep and passionate feelings, we maintain our grounding in God's salvation and grace. I want you to imagine one valley time in your life. One time in your life when you were living with loss and grief. Where was God? How was the valley raised for you? When my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer the day before Thanksgiving in 2009, I found myself in one of those valleys of loss and grief. Where was God? Well, God was in the communities to which I belong. In particular, I remember running into a member of our bishop's staff at the Cathedral Center one day when I was down there for a meeting. Someone I didn't really know well. I mean, we'd known each other in passing, but I didn't have any direct contact with her. But she told me she had heard the news about my mom and asked me how I was doing. I told her I was doing all right, but I was having a hard time praying, which is funny because I pray a lot, and I pray a lot for other people. But I was really struggling to find ways to pray for my mom because I was just overwhelmed by this news. And she responded, "That's okay, Melissa. That's what we're here for. Let us do the praying, and you lean on us." Now that was God's presence. Think of a mountain time in your life, a time when you were fearful or anxious.